The Concorde moved faster than Sethal had calculated. She had estimated 5 rotations before the surveillance networks flagged her unauthorized transmission. She had estimated another 2 before the intelligence committees convened, and another 3 before a response was authorized. She had been wrong. The Vandori had been watching her since the moment she invoked the right of final witness. Not because they suspected treason. The Vandori did not think in terms as small as treason, but because the Vandori watched everything, the way a predator watches the grass, not for any particular movement, but for the principle of movement itself, because anything that moves can become a problem, and problems are easier to kill when they are small. Sethal's transmission to Earth lit up the Concorde's monitoring grid like a flare in a dark room. The arrest was quiet. The Concorde did not do spectacle. Spectacle implied that the audience's attention mattered. The Concorde had long ago decided that the only audience that mattered was itself. 2 Vandori enforcement vessels materialized around Sethal's archive ship, locking it in a gravity envelope that made movement impossible, and a single Vandori officer boarded, with the unhurried calm of someone who has done this many times, and expects to do it many more. Archivist Sethal, of the Quarren, the officer said, "You are charged with unauthorized contact with a culling scheduled species. Your transmissions have been seized. Your personal archives are now property of the Concorde Intelligence Division. Your species has been notified of the pending sanctions." Sethal sat in her chair and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had known this would happen. She had done the math the way she did all math, completely, without comfort, without the pleasant delusions that other species use to soften the weight of hard choices. She had chosen to transmit, knowing it would cost her freedom, and possibly her civilization's standing in the Concorde. And she had done it because the alternative, letting the proof die, letting the wound stay open, letting the universe remain locked behind a door that a handful of cold and stubborn humans had almost opened, was a cost she was not willing to pay. The Vandori officer took her from her ship. The relay station where the coalition had met was raided within the hour. The Droon delegate subdrones were confiscated. The Mahesh translators were placed under diplomatic quarantine. The Kellis was shattered, its crystalline body fractured by a targeted harmonic pulse that the Vandori called restraint, and that everyone else called what it was. The Nameless One was gone. Its corner of the relay station was empty, as if it had never been there, as if the space it had occupied had simply decided to forget it. And when the Vandori searched for it, in the Concorde's records, in the surveillance archives, in the deep memory of the chamber itself, they found nothing, not absence, not deletion. Nothing, as if the concept of the Nameless One had been quietly removed from the vocabulary of reality. The Concorde convened an emergency session. The Vandori presented the seized transmissions, Sethal's outgoing signal, the proof, the coordinates pointing to the wound, and the chamber responded with the cold, focused efficiency of an institution that had been eliminating threats for longer than most stars had been burning. "Accelerate the culling," the Vandori delegate said. "The scheduled gamma burst will be initiated within 1 rotation. The species will be sterilized before any further contact can occur." The vote was not even called. The emergency protocols allowed the Vandori to act unilaterally when a security threshold was breached, and unauthorized contact with a condemned species was so far beyond the threshold that the paperwork was almost an insult. Pulsar NT-4412 was activated. The directed gamma burst, a beam of radiation so focused and so powerful that it could strip the atmosphere from a planet in hours, began its alignment sequence, calculating the angle, the intensity, the exact rotational position of Earth required to ensure that when the beam arrived, it would hit the planet broadside and leave nothing alive. Time remaining, 1 rotation. 72 hours in human counting. Lena did not know any of this. She knew only the proof, and the wound, and the coordinates that the stranger had sent her. The precise mathematical location of her failure, circled in red by hands that were not human. like a teacher, marking an exam with a single note in the margin that said, almost. She had been working for 60 hours straight. Marco brought her food she did not eat, coffee she drank without tasting. He replaced the cup when it was empty, and said nothing, because Marco understood the way that engineers understand things, which is structurally, fundamentally, in the load-bearing bones of a situation, that what Lena was doing right now was not something you could help with. You could only be near it. Yuki monitored the instruments and ran parallel analyses and double-checked Lena's work in real time, catching errors, flagging inconsistencies, doing the precise and thankless labor that made genius possible, because genius was not a solo act. It never had been. It was a person standing at the front of a room full of people who had quietly built the floor she was standing on. Dev watched the sky. He sat at the monitoring station with his headphones on, listening to the frequencies that Sethal's signal had arrived on, waiting for something more, a second message, a clarification, a sign that the stranger who had answered was still out there. The frequencies were silent. He did not know that the stranger had been arrested, know that the coalition had been broken. He did not know that a beam of radiation was being aimed at the planet he was sitting on. He knew only that Lena was working, and the sky was quiet, and the wind outside was trying to kill them, as it always was. Lena solved the wound at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday. She did not shout, she did not cry, she put her pen down. She still worked on paper for the final steps, because paper was honest in a way that screens were not. Paper showed you the mess, the crossings out, the false starts, the human wreckage of the thinking process. And she looked at the completed proof and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not relief. The nothing that comes after a very long time of carrying something heavy. The moment the weight is gone, and the body does not know what to do with the absence. Lena, Yuki said, and her voice was very quiet, and her face, the face that never showed anything. Something now. I know, Lena said. It works. I know. Marco stood behind her chair. His hands were on her shoulders. She leaned back into the solid, warm, wall-like fact of him, and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of darkness and silence, and the knowledge that the thing she had spent 11 years building was finished. Then she opened her eyes. Transmit it, she said. The whole proof, Dev asked. Everything. Full power. Every frequency we can reach. Dev hesitated. Lena, we don't even know who's listening. We don't know what's out there. We don't know. I know we don't know. Transmit it anyway. Dev looked at Marco. Marco looked at Yuki. Yuki looked at her instruments. Do it, Yuki said. Dev activated the transmission array. The completed proof, 11 years of work, 60 hours of final desperate labor. The wound closed, the spiral complete, the contradiction resolved, went out. From the antenna at the top of Halley 7, at the speed of light. And then something happened that none of them expected. The proof did not travel. It arrived. Not outward, not along the electromagnetic spectrum, not through the slow and patient medium of radio waves crawling across the vacuum. It arrived everywhere, simultaneously, in every receiver, and every relay, and every listening post in the galaxy, because the proof was not a description of non-local information transfer. It was non-local information transfer. The proof proved itself by existing. The medium was the message. In the Concord chamber, every instrument screamed at once. The Vandori delegates' control interface shattered under the weight of incoming data. Data that had not traveled, had not been routed, had not passed through any relay or network or physical medium. Data that was simply there, in every system, at every point, as if it had always been there. Universe had only just decided to let everyone see it. Pulsar NT-4412's alignment sequence was overwhelmed. Its targeting systems, designed to process information from a single stellar source, were flooded with a signal that existed in every direction simultaneously. And the beam that was meant to end the world stuttered, lost coherence, and scattered into the void like a shout into wind. The culling failed. Not because someone stopped it, not because someone made an argument, or cast a vote, or filed a motion. It failed because the proof's arrival had rewritten the rules of the game. Every species in the galaxy received the signal. Every civilization, from the Vandori's ancient war machines to the Mahesh's gentle archives of translated pain, to the Droon's billion-bodied hive, received in the same instant a piece of mathematics that could not exist and did exist and proved its own existence by the act of arriving. And every species that received it knew where it came from. Not because the signal was labeled, not because Lena had attached a return address, because the proof's structure, the spiraling, contradicting, self-resolving, beautiful, broken, stubbornly human architecture of it, could not have come from any civilization that thought in straight lines. It could only have come from a species that built logic the wrong way around, and arrived at the right answer through a path that no one else would have taken. Erasing Earth now would not bury the secret. It would confirm that the Concord destroyed what it could not control, and 4,000 civilizations had just received proof that there were things in the universe that could not be controlled, and that those things were magnificent. The Vandori delegates stood in the ruined chamber and said nothing for a very long time. The Nameless One reappeared. Not in the relay station, not in the chamber, but in the signal itself, a presence, woven into the mathematics like a watermark, like a signature written in the margins of the proof, as if it had known the proof was coming and had placed itself inside it, the way a seed places itself inside the ground. When it spoke, its word arrived in every translator in the galaxy simultaneously. This is what we were waiting for. The culling was suspended. Not cancelled. The Concord did not admit error, had never admitted error, would go to its grave, insisting that every decision it had ever made was correct and necessary and wise, but suspended, indefinitely, pending further evaluation of the species in question. Sethal was released from custody without comment. Her archives were returned, her sanctions were quietly dropped. The Concord's official record of the incident was 4 words long. Matter resolved, no action. She returned to her ship and pointed her instruments at Earth, and found Lena's signals still broadcasting. The completed proof, running on a loop, pouring out of a metal box on an ice sheet at the bottom of a planet that did not know how close it had come to dying. Sethal listened. And for the first time in her career as an archivist, a career spent recording the final moments of species that would never know they had been recorded, she was not building a funeral. She was witnessing a beginning. In the coffin at the bottom of the world, Lena Mwangi sat in a plastic chair in a room that smelled like old coffee and recycled air, and the particular brand of human stubbornness that keeps people working in impossible conditions for impossible goals because the alternative is to stop. And stopping was the one thing Lena had never learned how to do. The card game was still on the table. Marco's losing hand face down, Dev's chips scattered, Yuki's cards arranged in the precise parallel lines she always arranged them in, because chaos was something Yuki tolerated in the universe, but not in her card game. On a poker table. The signal was out there now. The proof was finished. The wound was closed. And somewhere, impossibly far away, impossibly close, in every direction, and no direction at once, something was listening. Lena picked up her cards. "Whose deal?" she said. Admiral Renzo Achebe had been in the middle of explaining to 2 grown captains why they could not, in fact, resolve a jurisdictional dispute by challenging each other to a fistfight in the cargo bay, when the transmission from Eretha 7 arrived. He held up one finger to the captains. "Read the first line. Read the second line." Told the captains to get out. They got out. Achebe sat alone in his office, aboard the UEN Carthage, flagship of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet. 300 warships spread across 4 light-years of patrol space. And he read the transmission again, with the kind of attention he usually reserved for things that were about to change the shape of his life. Doctrine 7. He had studied it at the Academy 39 years ago. A contingency protocol written in language so cold and precise that the words themselves seemed to have been stripped of anything human. Which was ironic, given that Doctrine 7 existed for the most human reason imaginable. Someone had hurt children. Achebe opened the attached data package and spent 11 minutes reviewing what Commander Solveig had sent. Medical scans showing 14 small brains being eaten alive from the inside. Chemical analysis of the compound. Infiltration vectors showing exactly how the Valkyrie had introduced the toxin through the school's ventilation system at 3 in the morning. Time to reach peak concentration during the first hour of class. He noted the precision. He noted the planning. He noted that whoever had designed this attack had understood human childhood neurodevelopment well enough to calibrate the dosage for maximum damage to developing neural tissue. This was not an accident. This was not a cultural misunderstanding. This was a weapon built specifically to destroy human children. Achebe closed the data package. In his breast pocket, folded into a square no larger than his thumb, was a drawing his granddaughter Sophia had made for him. A purple dog with 7 legs standing on what she had explained was the moon, but the fun one. And he did not reach for it, did not touch the pocket, did not allow his hand to drift in that direction, because if he touched it now, he would have to feel what was underneath the cold calculation that was already building behind his eyes, and he could not afford to feel that yet. Not yet. The Galactic Union convened an emergency session within the hour. Achebe watched the feed from his office, standing because sitting felt wrong, and the session unfolded with the grinding predictability of a machine that had been designed to produce noise rather than action. The Valkyrie ambassador spoke first, a tall insectoid figure whose name translated to something like Keeper of Proportional Responses, which Achebe would have found funny under different circumstances. And the ambassador expressed deep concern about the allegations and reminded the assembly that the chemical compound in question was naturally occurring in the geological substrate of Eretha 7, and that a joint investigation would surely reveal that no deliberate action had been taken. 40 minutes of this. 40 minutes of a species that had poisoned children, explaining why poisoning children was actually a matter of perspective. The Thessian diplomat, Orivai, spoke next, measured, careful, the kind of voice that had brokered peace between 11 species and believed that the 12th would be no different. And she urged restraint and proportionality and multilateral dialogue and every other word that meant, please do not do what we all know you are about to do. Achebe muted the feed. He had heard enough. He opened a second channel, not the diplomatic channel, not the Union channel, but the encrypted military-grade line that connected directly to SOLCOM, Solar Command, the beating heart of Earth's war machine that sat in a bunker beneath the Swiss Alps and existed for exactly this kind of morning. This is Admiral Achebe, 7th Fleet, requesting authorization for Doctrine 7, reference Eretha 7 colonial incident, data package attached. He waited. Solcom had a review process, a chain of authorization that involved flag officers, civilian oversight, legal review, and a final sign-off from the Secretary General of the United Earth Government. A process designed to prevent exactly the kind of rapid escalation that Achebe was requesting. The authorization came back in 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Achebe had been in the military for 39 years, and he had never seen Solcom move that fast, had never seen the bureaucracy of human governance collapse into a single point of unified purpose with such terrifying speed. And he understood in that moment that every person in that chain, every admiral, every civilian official, Every lawyer, every politician had looked at those brain scans of 14 children and arrived at the same conclusion in the same breath. Someone was going to pay. Not someone, everyone. Every Valkyrie who had stood in the chain of command that authorized this attack, every institution that had enabled it, every structure that had made it possible. All of it was going to be taken apart with the methodical patience of a surgeon removing a tumor, and the galaxy was going to watch it happen. HFY addressed his fleet. He did not give a speech. He did not invoke honor or duty or vengeance, or any of the words that leaders used when they wanted to make violence feel noble. Violence was not noble, it was a tool, and tools did not require poetry. 14 human children are dying on Eretha 7, he said. The species responsible has been identified. Doctrine 7 is now active. You have your orders. The fleet moved as a single organism, drives spinning up in cascading sequence. Navigation computers plotting jump coordinates to Valkyrie home space. Weapon systems cycling through pre-combat diagnostics with the quiet efficiency of a body drawing breath before a scream. HFY watched the fleet deploy from the Carthage's command deck, and felt the familiar weight settle into his chest. The weight that came with knowing that he had just set in motion something that could not be stopped, something that would ripple through galactic politics for a century, something that would be debated and condemned and studied and feared. He did not care about the debate. He cared about 14 children. His communications officer reported incoming transmissions, the Galactic Union demanding an explanation, the Thessian delegation requesting an emergency audience, the Valkyrie government issuing a formal protest and threatening consequences. Consequences. HFY almost laughed. The Valkyrie were threatening consequences to the species that had invented nuclear weapons, and then used them on itself, and then built more. The species that had clawed its way out of its own gravity well through sheer stubbornness and the absolute refusal to accept that the universe was not theirs to walk through. The species whose entire history was a long, unbroken chain of someone saying, "You cannot do this," followed by a human doing it anyway. Consequences. HFY sent a private message, direct to his personal channel, bypassing protocol, which meant she was scared enough to be rude. "Admiral, please. The Valkyrie have a civilization of 9 billion. They have art and music and literature and children of their own. You cannot hold an entire species accountable for the actions of." HFY read her message. He understood her position. He even respected it in the abstract. Way 1 respects a beautiful theory that has never survived contact with the real world. He typed 2 words and sent them. "Watch me." Then he closed the channel. He stood at the window of the Carthage's command deck and watched the stars stretch and blur as the fleet entered its jump sequence. 300 ships tearing holes in the fabric of space because 14 children on a farming colony had been poisoned in their school. In his breast pocket, the purple dog with 7 legs sat on the fun moon. He did not touch it. He did not need to. The fleet jumped, and the galaxy, which had spent 3 centuries learning to trade with humans and argue with humans and occasionally even like humans, was about to learn the one lesson that every species learns sooner or later. Do not touch their children. Do not ever touch their children. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had not slept in 41 hours, and the lab was starting to look like the inside of her mind, cluttered, unstable, and one bad decision away from total collapse. 14 children were dying, and the counteragent was not working. And every time Yuki thought she had found the right molecular configuration, the compound destabilized and fell apart like a house of cards built by someone who had never seen a house or a card. She stood at her workstation, surrounded by holographic molecular models that floated in the air, like ghosts of solutions that almost existed. And she talked to herself, because there was no one else in the lab at 4 in the morning, and talking helped her think. The pheromone bonds to the myelin sheath at the receptor level. If I can isolate the binding agent and create a competitive inhibitor. The model collapsed. Again. Yuki put her hands flat on the table and pressed down hard enough to feel the edges of the surface dig into her palms, a sensation that was useful because it reminded her that the physical world still existed and that she was still in it. 3 years she had lived among the Valkyrie. 3 years of studying their biology with the kind of obsessive fascination that her colleagues at the university had called dedicated, and her mother had called a replacement for actual human relationships. And both of them had been right, in ways that Yuki did not enjoy thinking about. She had learned their caste system from the inside, the way their larval pheromones triggered biological differentiation, the elegant cascade of chemical signals that turned identical larvae into workers or soldiers, or thinkers or queens, and she had published 6 papers on the subject, and given a keynote lecture at the Xenobiology Conference on Titan, and been quoted in 3 Union policy documents recommending expanded colonial rights for the Valkyrie. She had called them a species of remarkable neuroplasticity and sophisticated social architecture. She had called them remarkable, and they had taken her research and used it to build a weapon that was eating the brains of 14 children. Yuki did not throw the molecular model across the room. She wanted to. She very specifically and intensely wanted to pick up the holographic projector and hurl it at the wall with enough force to shatter something. Because shattering something would feel productive, even though it would accomplish nothing. And the gap between what she wanted and what she did was the gap between the person she was and the person the children needed her to be. She rebuilt the model. Failed. Rebuilt it. Failed. Rebuilt it. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from the particular kind of fury that comes when you realize that your own competence is not enough, that the thing you trained your entire life to be good at is failing you at the exact moment when being good at it matters most. The door opened. Marin walked in. Marin did not look like she had been awake for 41 hours. Marin looked like she had been awake for 41 years and had simply decided that sleep was a concept she no longer recognized. And she set a cup of something hot on Yuki's workstation without asking whether Yuki wanted it, because Marin did not ask questions she already knew the answers to. "I need larval tissue," Yuki said. "I know. Live Valkyrie larval tissue, fresh enough to contain active pheromone precursors. Without it, I cannot calibrate the counteragent because the binding mechanism is species-specific, and I need the original template to build the inhibitor. I know. They will never give it to us voluntarily. I know." Marin sat on the edge of the workstation and looked at Yuki with the expression of a woman who was about to say something that neither of them wanted to hear. "We captured a Valkyrie supply runner 2 hours ago. Young, low caste, trying to leave the colony through the northern ridge. He is in holding." Yuki understood what Marin was not saying. Valkyrie low-caste workers retained larval pheromone glands well into adulthood, vestigial structures that served no function but still produced trace amounts of the compounds Yuki needed. And extracting a tissue sample would be possible, but it would be painful, and it would be done without consent. And it would be the kind of thing that Yuki had spent her career arguing should never be done to any species under any circumstances. "He is terrified," Marin said. "He does not understand what is happening. He may not even know about the attack. Low-caste workers are not told things. That makes it worse." "I know. I swore an oath, Marin." Marin looked at her and said nothing. And in the silence, Yuki could hear the medbay monitors through the wall. 14 small heartbeats being tracked by machines that did not care whether the hearts they monitored belonged to children or animals or machines. And one of those heartbeats was Lila's, 4 years old, who had given Yuki a drawing of a space fish last week and asked if fish could live on other planets. And Yuki had said, maybe, if we are clever enough to figure out how. Clever enough. Yuki went to the holding cell. The Valkyrie runner was young, barely past metamorphosis, his exoskeleton still carrying the pale blue sheen of recent molting, and he was pressed into the corner of the cell, with his 4 arms wrapped around his thorax, in the Valkyrie posture of absolute submission, and his compound eyes tracked Yuki as she entered, with the kind of animal recognition that transcended species. He knew what she was there for. She explained the procedure in his language. She spoke Valkyrie fluently, another gift from her 3 years of dedicated study, and she told him it would hurt, but that she would be as careful as possible, and that he would survive. He did not respond. She extracted the tissue sample in 6 minutes. He made a sound during the procedure that Yuki had never heard a Valkyrie make before, a low harmonic vibration that resonated in the bones of her wrist. And she understood from her research that this was the sound Valkyrie larvae made when they were afraid and calling for their queen. He was calling for someone who would never come. Yuki sealed the sample, left the cell, walked to the nearest maintenance corridor, and pressed her forehead against the cold metal wall, and stayed there for 90 seconds. Then she went back to the lab. The larval tissue was exactly what she needed. The pheromone precursors were intact and active, and within 20 minutes she had mapped the complete binding mechanism, and built a competitive inhibitor that locked onto the same neural receptors as the toxin, but blocked the degradation cascade instead of triggering it. The counter-agent stabilized. It held. Yuki tested it 3 times on synthetic neural tissue models, and each time the compound performed exactly as designed, halting the degradation and allowing the damaged pathways to begin the slow process of rebuilding. She ran to the medbay. She administered the counteragent to Lila first, because Lila was the youngest and the most damaged, and because the spacefish drawing was still pinned to Yuki's lab wall, and because some decisions are not made with the brain. Hours passed. The monitors changed. Lila's neural scans, which had been a map of destruction, pathways dissolving, connections severing, a 4-year-old mind being unmade, began to stabilize. Then, to rebuild. Tiny green indicators appeared on the scan where there had been only red, like the first shoots of grass after a fire. Watch them multiply and spread, and she did not cry, because crying would mean stopping, and she could not stop. Not yet, not until all 14 were treated. She moved from cot to cot, child after child. The counteragent worked every time. By morning, all 14 children were stable, their neural tissue no longer degrading. The long, slow process of recovery, beginning in brains that were young enough and plastic enough to heal from what had been done to them. Yuki sat down on the floor of the medbay because there were no chairs nearby, and her legs had decided they were finished. Marin brought her another cup of something hot. "You did it," Marin said. Yuki did not answer. She was staring at her datapad, at a file she had opened without meaning to, her research archive, 3 years of work, 6 published papers, 247 datasets, the most comprehensive study of Valkyrie neurobiology ever conducted by a human scientist. And there, in the correspondence folder, a message from HFY War dated 6 months ago. He had requested her published work on human childhood neurodevelopment, her comparative study of human and Valkyrie neural growth patterns, and she had sent it to him with a note that said, "Happy to share, science is collaboration." Science is collaboration. They had used her data to calibrate the weapon. Her research had told them exactly which neural pathways to target, exactly what concentrations would cause maximum damage to developing human brains, exactly how to turn her life's work into a poison that ate children from the inside. Yuki selected all 247 datasets, selected all 6 papers, selected the entire archive, deleted it. 3 years of work vanished in the time it takes to blink. Marin watched, but said nothing. Yuki picked up the hot cup, drank from it, and discovered it was tea. Plain, black tea. The kind her mother used to make. The kind that tasted like a kitchen in Osaka at 6 in the morning. when the world was still simple, and nobody had yet asked her to choose between her oath and a 4-year-old girl. She drank the tea. She did not rebuild the archive. Some things, once broken, have the decency to stay that way. Captain Deshi Okoro had a rule about pre-combat silence. He did not allow it. Silence before a fight let the mind wander into the kind of dark rooms that Deshi had spent his whole adult life keeping locked. So he filled the cockpit of his fighter with noise, with chatter, with the sound of his own voice saying things that were not important, because the act of speaking was the point, not the content. All right, Viper Wing. Systems check. Kowalski, you still flying that thing, or did it finally file for divorce? Funny, Captain. Real funny. Reeves, how's your lateral thruster? Still pulling left? Fixed it with a cargo strap and a prayer, sir. Outstanding. That is exactly the level of engineering excellence I expect from this wing. His squad laughed. That was the point. Laughter meant they were not thinking about what 300 warships were about to do to a civilization of 9 billion. And not thinking about it was the key. Only way to do it cleanly, because clean was what Doctrine 7 demanded. The fleet dropped out of jump space at the edge of the Velkari home system, and the sight that greeted them was, in any other context, beautiful. The Velkari homeworld hung in the black, like a jewel made of amber and jade, ringed by orbital stations that glittered in the light of their yellow sun. And even from this distance, Deshi could see the traffic lanes of civilian transports moving between the stations in orderly patterns that spoke of a species that had been doing this for a very long time. 9 billion people lived down there. 9 billion people who ate and slept and argued and loved and raised their children and built things and broke things and tried every day to make sense of a universe that made no sense. Which was exactly what humans did, which was exactly what every species did, and Deshi knew this because he was not stupid, and he was not cruel, and he understood that he was about to do was not justice, it was consequence. The Velkari defense fleet mobilized within minutes. 87 ships, old designs, heavy on ceremonial armor, and light on actual weapon systems. The kind of fleet a species builds when it has never met anything it could not intimidate into submission. They had never met humans in a war posture. The lead Velkari vessel broadcast a warning that Deshi's translator rendered as, "You have entered sovereign Velkari space. Depart immediately or face the full might of the Velkari ascendancy." Full might. 87 ships against 300. Deshi would have felt sorry for them if he could afford to feel anything right now. But he could not, because somewhere in the back of his mind, a 9-year-old boy was standing in a corridor on a space station where the air recyclers had just failed, and the oxygen was thinning, and the adults were screaming, and the boy was not screaming. Screaming used air, and air was the thing that was disappearing, and that boy had learned something in those 6 hours that he had never unlearned. Panic is a luxury. You breathe shallow, you stay quiet, you survive. Viper Wing, weapons hot, target the orbital defense platforms first, then the military communication relays. Civilian structures are off limits. I say again, civilian structures are absolutely off limits. Anyone who fires on a civilian target answers to me personally, and I promise you that conversation will be worse than anything the Velkari can do to you. Copy, Captain. Copy. Copy. The battle, if it could be called a battle, lasted less than an hour. The Velkari defense fleet fought with the desperate courage of a species that understood it was outmatched and chose to fight anyway. Which Deshi respected, which every human pilot in the fleet respected, because courage was courage regardless of the uniform. It war. But courage did not stop railgun rounds. Courage did not jam targeting systems. Courage did not make old ships faster or weak shields stronger. Deshi's wing dismantled an orbital command station in 9 minutes. peeling away its defensive layers with surgical precision, targeting power cores and communication arrays and weapons hardpoints, while leaving the civilian docking bays and escape pod systems intact. This was not destruction. This was dentistry. They were removing the parts that bit. The Valkyrie government broadcast a surrender offer 4 hours into the operation. They would hand over Skethus Vor and the architects of the Eretha 7 attack, submit to a war crimes tribunal, pay reparations, accept a demilitarized zone around all human colonial space. Admiral Achebe's response was broadcast on an open channel so every ship in both fleets could hear it. Insufficient. One word. The offer had been expected. It was the rational response, the proportional concession, the diplomatic move that any species would make when facing overwhelming force. And it was insufficient because Doctrine 7 was not about punishment. It was about capability. The Valkyrie had demonstrated the capability to build biological weapons targeting human children. That capability was going to be removed. Not the people who used it. The capability itself. Phase 2 began. Shipyards, gone. Weapons manufacturing facilities, gone. FTL communication relays, gone. Military academies, gone. Research facilities with dual-use potential, gone. Every structure, every system, every institution that could rebuild the Valkyrie war machine was identified, targeted, and dismantled, with the methodical patience of a gardener pulling weeds. No rush, no anger, no wasted motion. Just the steady systematic removal of everything that had made this possible. Galactic Union exploded. 17 species formally condemned Earth. The Thessians, the Drenari, the Maku Federation, all the usual voices of reason and restraint. And sanctions were threatened, and alliances were reconsidered, and the diplomatic channels burned with outrage and fear. Achebe did not acknowledge the transmissions. Deshi did not hear them. He was too busy flying. His next target was a Valkyrie orbital dry dock, a massive structure in high orbit above the homeworld, a place where warships were born and repaired, a place that represented decades of engineering and ambition and pride. His scans showed it had been evacuated. Mostly. One sector, the lower maintenance ring, still showed life signs. 30 Valkyrie workers. Trapped. A bulkhead failure had sealed the emergency exits, and the evacuation shuttles could not reach them. The station's internal power was failing, which meant the atmospheric systems were. Failing which meant 30 people who had nothing to do with the attack on Eretha 7 were about to suffocate in a metal box because they had the bad luck to be at work on the wrong day. Deshi looked at the scan data. 30 life signs. Workers. Non-combatants. The 9-year-old boy in the back of his mind stood in a corridor where the air was thinning. Viper Wing. Hold fire on the dry dock. Kowalski, Reeves, divert to the lower maintenance ring and cut those people out of there. Rescue protocol. Full atmospheric seal. Get them onto your cargo bays. Captain, command has not authorized. I did not ask command. I asked you. Move. They moved. It took 4 minutes to cut through the sealed bulkhead, extract 30 Valkyrie workers, some unconscious, some clinging to each other in the Valkyrie posture of communal distress, and load them onto the 2 rescue shuttles. The workers were alive. Complete. Then he fired. The dry dock broke apart in silence, because space does not carry sound, and the debris spread outward in a slow expanding cloud that caught the light of the yellow sun, and glittered like 1,000 falling stars, which was beautiful, which was terrible, which was both of those things at once. His sortie report would show that the dry dock destruction took 4 minutes longer than projected. No one asked why. Deshi did not explain. There are things you do not because you are ordered to, not because they make tactical sense, not because anyone will ever know or care, but because the boy in the corridor needs to believe that when the air runs out, someone will come to cut through the door. The Velkari military infrastructure ceased to exist in 71 hours. Their cities stood. Their farms produced. Their hospitals healed. Their children played in streets that had never seen a human weapon. Doctrine 7 did not target children. Doctrine 7 existed because someone else had. When it was over, Deshi sat in his cockpit in the silence he usually did not allow, and he breathed, not shallow, not careful, just breathed. And the air tasted like recycled metal and sweat and the particular flavor of a man who had just spent 3 days dismantling a civilization's ability to hurt anyone ever again. He closed his eyes. The 9-year-old boy in the corridor sat down. The air was thin, but it was there. Someone had come. 6 months after the fall of the Velkari military, diplomat Oravai of the Thessian Concord sat in the central chamber of the Galactic Union Tribunal and tried to remember the last time she had been afraid. It had been a long time. Thessians lived for centuries, and Oravai had lived for 2 of them. And in those 200 years, she had brokered peace between 11 species, prevented 3 wars, negotiated the end of 2 others, and built a career on the unshakable belief that every conflict in the galaxy could be resolved through patience and process, and the careful application of words, spoken at the right time, in the right order. She had been wrong. Not about most conflicts. About 1 species. The tribunal chamber was full, representatives from 43 member species seated in their designated arcs, the gallery packed with observers and journalists and historians, who understood that what happened in this room would be studied for centuries. And at the center of it all, 2 delegations facing each other across a floor made of polished stone from 12 different worlds. The Velkari delegation sat on the left, 3 officials in formal carapace adornments, their compound eyes betraying nothing, their forearmed posture arranged in the configuration that meant dignified restraint. And they had come to make the case that what humanity had done to them was disproportionate, illegal, and an act of collective punishment that violated every principle the Galactic Union was built on. They were not wrong about the law. The law was very clear. The human delegation sat on the right, a single representative, which was either an insult or a statement of such overwhelming confidence that it looped back around to being an insult again. A civilian lawyer named Adeze Nwosu, 34 years old, born in Lagos, educated on 3 planets, and possessed of the kind of quiet that made rooms full of powerful people lean forward in their seats to make sure they did not miss a word. Oravai had read Nwosu's file. Nothing in it had prepared her. The Velkari senior delegate spoke first. A lengthy, carefully structured argument that touched on sovereignty, proportionality, collective responsibility, the precedent this set for future disputes, the economic damage to an entire species, the psychological trauma inflicted on 9 billion civilians who had played no part in the Aretha 7 incident. The argument was compelling. It was also irrelevant, and everyone in the room knew it. But the tribunal had procedures, and the procedures required that the argument be made, which was perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of everything the Galactic Union was. A place where the correct words were spoken in the correct order, while the actual decisions had already been made somewhere else. When the Velkari delegate finished, Oravai invited the human representative too. Nwosu stood. She was small, not physically imposing, not intimidating in any way that the other species in the room would recognize as threatening. And she wore a plain dark suit, and no adornments, and her hair was pulled back, and her hands were empty, and she looked like exactly what she was, a human. Just a human. She did not begin with a legal argument. She activated the chamber's display system and projected 14 medical scans, before and after, each one labeled with a name and an age. Kaya, 7. Marcus, 9. Petra, 6. Pavel, 6. Lila, 4. The before scans showed healthy developing brains, bright with neural activity, dense with connections, alive with the electric architecture of children learning to be people. The afterscans showed devastation, dark zones where tissue had dissolved, severed pathways, holes in the neural map like someone had taken a torch to a garden. The room was silent. Let the scans hang in the air for 30 seconds. Then she played the audio. Not dramatic, not scored with music, just raw medical monitoring data. The sound of a 6-year-old girl seizing, the rhythmic alarm of a heart rate monitor spiking, the flat mechanical voice of a diagnostic system reporting neural degradation exceeding recoverable threshold. The Maku representative closed her eyes. The Drenari ambassador looked at the floor. The Thessian delegation, Orivai's own people, sat perfectly still in the way that Thessians sat when they were processing something that did not fit inside their existing understanding of how the universe worked. Nuosu stopped the audio. She projected the ventilation system logs, time-stamped records showing the exact moment the toxin was introduced into the school's air supply. 3 in the morning, calibrated to peak at the start of the school day. Designed to hit developing neural tissue at the point of maximum vulnerability. She showed the chemical analysis, the compound tailored to human neurobiology using data published by a human scientist who had shared her work in the spirit of interspecies cooperation. She showed the internal Velkari communications that human intelligence had intercepted after the attack. Messages between Skethis Vor and the Velkari military caste discussing the operation as a strategic demonstration designed to test human psychological resilience thresholds. A test. They had poisoned 14 children as a test. Nuosu stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the Velkari delegation and then at the assembled representatives of 43 species, and she spoke her closing argument in a single sentence. You may debate whether our response was proportional. We will debate whether your species' children are worth protecting as fiercely as ours. She sat down. The chamber was the kind of silent that has weight. The kind that presses against the eardrums and makes the air feel thick. And Orivai, who had brokered peace between 11 species, who had spent 2 centuries believing in the power of words, realized that she had just heard the most dangerous sentence ever spoken in this chamber. Not because it was a threat, because it was a question. And every ambassador in the room was now asking it about their own children. The tribunal recessed. Orivai returned to her private chambers and sat in the dark because Thessians thought best in low light, and she had a great deal of thinking to do. She opened her personal archive and accessed humanity's complete military history. Not the diplomatic summaries she had relied on for decades, not the filtered assessments prepared by union analysts, but the raw data, the actual records, every conflict humanity had fought since they first left their homeworld and stumbled into a galaxy that had not asked for them. For hours, she tracked every major escalation, every moment where humans had shifted from measured response to total commitment, from proportional to overwhelming, from we would prefer peace to peace is no longer available. The pattern was so clear she could not believe she had missed it. Not territory, not resources, not ideology, not insult or dishonor or economic threat. Children, every single time. The outer colony massacres of 2,187, human children killed in a pirate raid. Humanity hunted the responsible faction for 11 years across 4 star systems until every member was dead or captured. Not because the pirates were a strategic threat, but because some of the children had been under the age of 5. The Kepler Station incident, a life support failure that killed 6 children due to negligent maintenance by a contracted alien engineering firm. Humanity rewrote the entire galactic infrastructure safety code, bankrupted the firm and every subsidiary it had ever operated. The Drenari border dispute of 2203, a conflict that had been simmering for a decade, with no resolution until a stray munition hit a school transport. Full human military deployment within 48 hours. The war ended in 72, and the Draenari had been humanity's most reliable ally ever since because they understood what they had accidentally triggered, and they never wanted to see it again. The pattern did not vary. The pattern did not weaken over time. The pattern was not cultural or political or strategic. It was biological, written into the species at a level so deep that no amount of civilization or sophistication or galactic integration had softened it even slightly. A reflex as fundamental as breathing, as involuntary as a heartbeat. And HFY sat in the dark of her chamber and understood for the first time that she had been negotiating with a species whose deepest motivation she had never once taken seriously. She had filed it under cultural variance. She had treated it as a negotiable trait. She had believed, with 2 centuries of diplomatic confidence, that all species could be reasoned with, because all species ultimately prioritize survival. She had been wrong. Humans did not ultimately prioritize survival. Humans ultimately prioritized their children, and they would burn everything. Alliances, treaties, trade agreements, their own reputation, their own safety, the careful diplomatic architecture of an entire galaxy, to protect them. The tribunal reconvened the next day. The vote was taken. Earth was formally censured. A diplomatic reprimand, a note in the official record, a slap on the wrist, wrapped in language designed to look like accountability, while actually meaning, we acknowledge what you did, and we have decided to pretend it was slightly less terrifying than it was. Species voted for expulsion. Not one. Not even the Valkyries' closest allies. Not even the species who had publicly condemned humanity in the strongest terms. Not even the ones who had threatened sanctions and boycotts and diplomatic isolation. Because every ambassador in that chamber had children. And every ambassador in that chamber had watched a human lawyer project the brain scans of 14 poisoned kids and ask a question that none of them could answer without looking at their own families and feeling something cold move through their chest. The vote was unanimous. Earth remained in the Galactic Union. The Valkyrie accepted the destruction of their military infrastructure as a settled matter and began the long, slow process of rebuilding their civilization around the understanding that some species are simply not to be tested. And HFY, in her private chambers, wrote a single entry in her diplomatic journal, a document she had maintained for 187 years, a record of every negotiation and every lesson and every truth she had learned about the galaxy. The entry was short. There are species you negotiate with. There are species you coexist with. And there are species you do not, under any circumstances, for any reason, regardless of provocation or strategic advantage or perceived necessity, harm the children of. Humanity is the third kind. I should have known this. Every species should know this. Now they do. She closed the journal. Somewhere on Aretha 7, a 4-year-old girl named Lila was learning to wave again. Her brain was healing. Her hand was clumsy, and the wave was lopsided, and Captain Carrots the stuffed rabbit had to help. But she was waving, and that single small imperfect wave from a child who should have died, was worth every ship, every sanction, every burned alliance, every sleepless night in every cockpit, and every command deck, and laboratory, and tribunal chamber. That was the lesson. That was always the lesson. You protect the small ones. Whatever it costs, you protect them.